O'clock, Prince Harry has admitted for the first time that he took cocaine when he was a teenager. A copy of his book has been obtained in which the Duke of Sussex says he first took the Class A drug on a hunting weekend. He's also accused his brother William of becoming physical during a row about the Duchess of Sussex in 2019. In an interview with ITV, he was asked what he'd say to those accusing him of invading his family's privacy.
That would be the accusation from the people that don't understand or don't want to believe that my family have been briefing the press.
Kensington Palace has declined to comment. The government has called for unions to get back around the table and to call off strikes. Ministers have also revealed details of their anti-strike legislation, which would enforce minimum levels of service. Unions could be sued if fire, rail and ambulance services aren't able to maintain basic function. Sir Keir Starmer has promised to transfer power from Westminster in what he called a Taking Back Control Bill. During his first speech of the new year, the Labour leader says as Prime Minister he would hand powers to communities. Sir Keir says it would give people more of a say over things like childcare, transport and housing. Peter Kyle, Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary, told LBC that the Labour Party are getting things right.
Keir's leadership, the front bench, the policy narratives we have, the ethos we have as a party, the clarity of vision that we have, the priorities we have with cost of living, tackling crime, sorting out the NHS and our public services. These are the priorities which are connecting with the public.
Ukraine says there will only ever be a ceasefire with Russia when their enemy is removed from Ukrainian land. President Putin's told his forces to stop fighting for 36 hours from tomorrow to mark the Russian Orthodox Christmas holiday. And hospital admissions for flu and coronavirus went down last week in England. However, the UK Health Security Agency says levels are still high. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 48 points at 76.33. The pound buys $1.19 and €1.13. LBC weather, rain moving into the far southeast tonight. Scattered showers are expected in northern and western Scotland with a low of 3. Dry and bright for most tomorrow. Blustery showers in the northwest easing with cloud building in from the west and highs of 12 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 8:03 on LBC. We're streaming this hour on Global Player, so if you'd like to watch us, you can do so. Those of you who were listening on Tuesday will have heard a relatively short interview I did with Professor Angus Dalgleish, Professor of Oncology at St George's University of London. And we were talking about NHS reform and the challenges that the NHS faces at the moment and what could be done differently. And it got quite a bit of reaction on social media, people emailing us saying, I want to hear more from the professor. So I'm obeying your wishes, basically, because I've invited him in for the next hour to talk about NHS reform. And what I want to try and achieve in this hour, Professor, and welcome, by the way, is to not get bogged down in the usual debate about, well, if you do that, that just means it's all going to be privatised or it's all about money. How difficult is it to reform an institution like the NHS, which is one of it employs more people than I think any other institution in the whole of Europe, and it's got various structures and different governments come in, different government ministers come in and say, well, we want to do this, that or the other, and then they find that you pull a lever and nothing happens. So how can we change it so it is more easy to reform?
Well, the problems with the reforms of the NHS is, going back over the history, which I've done recently, is every single reform from the very beginning has led to more problems and bigger disasters. And it's just been accumulative to the point where it's led to the collapse of what it is now. And I would say that one of the first ways to start is to start taking away the reforms that have caused so much damage and slowly get back to the model that worked. And I think that's very doable. For instance, think about the Lansley reforms that were introduced, where everybody had freedom to choose the doctor, do this, that and the other. It ended up in such total chaos that they were ripped up while the government was in power, and Lansley was very quickly shuffled off to the House of Lords before he could do any more more harm. And that really does sum it up. And then you go back to the other reforms, which I think are very core to why we're in such a mess. And that goes back to, say, Ken Clarke, who introduced these core reforms of trying to get the NHS to be more efficient. So he introduced some competition. And this isn't privatisation, by the way. This is competition between hospitals, and we ended up with the purchaser-provider split. So you have a team of people that purchase services off the local hospital or other hospitals across the border, whatever it is, to try and get the best deal. And this was meant to create great efficiency. Well, we now know that this great efficiency has an overhead charge of about 8% of all the money we spend on the NHS, and we could immediately get great efficiencies by getting rid of this. Now, why has it failed? Well, one of the main reasons it's failed is that people like competing and purchasing, and they compete to purchase for things which are profitable. So, say, cardiac procedures and some cancer treatments, they are profitable, so they compete. Now, what happens with this is that those services which are not profitable, they just get left on the floor of the pickings, and they're appallingly funded and treated, and mental health is one of these. And we are seeing the tragedy of not having a priority for mental health now, which is being completely decimated with the lockdown and COVID and long COVID, etc.
And yet the government say we're spending more money on mental health than ever.
Well, they'll always say they're going to spend more money, but I mean, they should have been spending that money or not ignoring the decline that was going on. And we've all witnessed the terrible decline in mental health issues. It takes months to get an urgent mental health thing for somebody whose whole life could be destroyed if it's not going to be put on track in the next 2 or 3 weeks. So that's just one of the other examples. And another major reform, which I think was one of the worst, they introduced McKinsey-style management into the hospital. So this was basically because the doctors left to their own devices, were clearly out of control, and they spent too much and did too many things for the patients. So they had to be reined in. And this is where, how was that done? Well, they got rid of the administrators, which used to do what the doctors thought was necessary for the population, and they had managers which said, you doctor do this, you do this, that and the other. And it completely removed the clinical lead, and I would say very, very importantly, morale began to sink. One of the things they did, and I was going through the registrar consultant level when this happened, they thought the medical lot they're a dangerous bunch of buggers, and they might cause a lot of trouble. So remove the consultant dining rooms, remove the doctor's mess, and then that will stop them, basic conniving,
collaborating,
and plotting. What it did was it totally destroyed the morale, social infrastructure. So they didn't have that an environment where they could converse. And I mean, I learned everything from older doctors when I had a major problem. You went to the mess and you basically said, what do I do about this patient, what have you? They don't have any of that infrastructure now. So, where am I coming from? One of the first things I would do, I would remove all these layers and I would slowly go back to the model that worked very, very well, because the managers have not saved money. In fact, the more money you spend on management, the less the productivity. And there were some lovely graphs published a few days ago on that, and they were so linear you couldn't believe it. Nobody could allow this state of affairs to continue. So I would rip out the layers of managers. And we know that there's some very, very dodgy layers of managers being appointed. There's all these diversity managers and things like that, just on twice the salaries without any need for qualifications as a doctor at the coalface needs. There's a whole load of managers, basically, whose main job is to bully doctors to make sure they have done their assessments and their validations, and they've done all this mandatory training. I mean, this is actually an insult, because when they run out of nothing to do, they say, oh, your mandatory trainings it's expired, you must do it all again. It takes about an hour a module. It's something. It can be two or 3 days of an entire year doing mandatory training for these doctors when they should be frontline.
And the training has nothing to do with their actual professional capabilities.
It's all political control. It's political correctness and control. So it's all layer upon layer. And what it does, it prevents the doctor actually being able to do what they originally wanted to do until they came into this mess. And this is one of the main things that I really want to push. We've got enough money for nurses, got enough money for doctors, but we can't spend it. So why do you need extra money? That's the first thing.
What do you mean we can't spend it?
We've got 40,000 nurses, which we haven't been able to recruit. They say we've recruited more nurses than ever before, but even more nurses have left out of disgust at the way they're being treated and the conditions. We have 40,000 consultant positions fully funded we cannot appoint. I'm in the Royal College of Physicians, and we just had a survey to say that 40% of all the NHS consultant positions, for everything from psychiatry to surgery, we could not appoint anybody. Why? However, we lowered the standard. So the first thing that you have to do is to stop the attrition, the leaving of these people, and you have to find out why and keep them. You can't keep going around the world.
Well, where are they going? Are they leaving to go to other countries? Are they leaving for the private sector?
Well, that's a very good question, because I've been asking that question. The junior doctors are looking in droves at Australia and Canada, similar countries. The senior doctors are basically looking to reduce their exposure to the NHS and go private or go into other areas like pharmaceutical companies, etc. That's a very popular way because they pay you more and you don't have the same responsibilities and stress, which is a really major problem. I talk to all my colleagues, and this constant stress is a major issue, and there's no way of helping the colleagues cope with that constant stress in the structure where we have deliberately been cut off and isolated, had our dining rooms and messes removed from us, so we can't actually have that camaraderie of support that we always had. So this has to come back, because doctors who really wanted to be doctors, and I've spoken to them. I've spoken to one person who was doing very well in the city, and he decided he'd like to do something very useful with his life. So he came back to St George's and we were the first medical school to have a fast graduate entry scheme. So if you'd done something else, you're obviously very good and bright, we'd actually give you the essentials of medicine in 2 or 3 years and put you out there. But I was horrified to find that this he's really wanted to do. He loved it until he qualified and he got put as a doctor in the hospital. And in his second year, he said, "This is an impossible. It's like working in an asylum. You cannot work like this. It's so badly managed." He gave up and went back to the city. I mean, that's just one little anecdote. But there are so many. I think the figures that I saw were previously, the assured ones, were that 20% of doctors qualified weren't working as doctors in 5 years' time. I've been told that figures are out of date and that the figure is higher. So retention, making the job attractive, and stop bullying them, because so many doctors feel that they're bullied.
But presumably there's a huge amount of institutional resistance to this idea, because it would mean, as you said earlier, it would mean doing away with a whole level of management, and the instinct is to, among those managers, will be to defend their position.
Well, of course. I mean, that's totally natural, and that's what they've done.
But who can cut through that? Is it politicians that cut through that, or is it the boards of the different trusts that have to cut through that?
Well, the boards of the different trusts, that was one of the purposes of having a trust, so they could have some degree of autonomy and sort these things out. And there's no doubt that the delivery of some services by some trusts is way superior to others, which proves that it can be done because they have done organisation in such a way. But, I saw two two reports recently which highlight the problem. First of all was a young graduate who had been hired to be one of the new managers in the NHS. And she openly admitted that after 3 months, she felt rather bored because she didn't have enough work to do. And she was on twice the salary of the junior doctors, basically under stress and can't cope and leaving. And then, so what does management result in? Well, first of all, it results in ludicrous decisions like, we've got a bit of a crisis, we'll build Nightingale hospitals everywhere for the COVID, totally forgetting that you've got wards up there that you can't staff. So where is the staff going to come from? So we spent millions and millions and millions building these things, only to not be able to staff them, and ended up pulling them all down again. And a incident closer to home was of a surgeon who was basically going in to do 3 major operation in his list. And when he arrived, all the surgical kit, all the bits and pieces, say if you're doing hip operation, etc., only one of the operations had the appropriate kit. The 2 other operations had inappropriate kit, so they had to be cancelled, patients sent home. You've got an enormous expensive team here. You've got the surgeons, all the assistants, you've got the anaesthetists, you've got all the ward staff, etc. Unbelievable waste of time and money, and one of the reasons that our waiting list is climbing up to 7 million and climbing. Until this thing is sorted out, we're never going to get.
But that's not something that a politician can sort out. That is institutional incompetence.
Well, the politician has to hold these people to account. They have to be. What does?
Well, a politician can't hold a team that are preparing an operation to account.
No, absolutely. But they have to hold the way that the people who they give the money to spend and are responsible for it. How would I sort that out? No, I would go back to the old way. The surgeon who's going to do those operations in charge, he has this matron or the head of the surgery, and he basically goes through basically what the administrator reports to him. We're going to do this, that, and the other operation. I need, the kit A1 for this, A2, this, that, and the other. They walk into the thing, and they will check the day before that everything's in place before they go and bring the patients into hospital, and they're taking up a bed. It can't be treated, and they waste the bed and everything else to go home. That is what surgical leadership, and I know cases, and I probably can't mention them by name, but I know them from colleagues, where when this was done, when we had the great lockdown and the NHS became the national COVID service, that within the trust, when a lot of managers left, it meant that the clinicians had to sort things out themselves. And I am aware, of one hospital that did this absolutely appropriately, because they realised there was no managers around. They made all the decisions themselves, and they hardly had any reduction in their non-COVID service whatsoever, because it is a clinical mindset you need to deal with these problems, like on the ground in an army. It's not decisions made way, way high up who never see. And it's true with the ward and the medical staff, they don't know really who the managers are. I mean, they're all emails and emails and emails. I've, as a senior consultant, working for several years, only met one chief executive officer who came to see me to have a chat about things that I was in the press for. Apart from that, I have no idea. I've never met the chairman or any of these people, so it's completely, utterly divorced. And you have to change that. That is the morale thing and staff, and it goes to retention, because unless you do this, you can have all the wonderful health facilities in the world you like, but if you don't have a dedicated, committed staff, they're of no use.
Well, in a moment, we'll talk a bit about the current situation regarding the GP service, ambulance service, and then we'll come to calls. If you want to put a question to Professor Dalgleish or have a comment on what he said so far, 0345 6060 973. Somebody's just texted in to say that you should be the health secretary. Fancy the job?
Poison chalice. Unless you do have free rein to cut through the big organisations like NHS England, PHE, all these sub-organisations, which I have many of my consultants say if they got rid of those, we could start to run the NHS properly. And I think there's a lot of truth in that.
OK, it's 8:20 on LBC.
This is LBC. Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
It's 22 minutes past 8. If you're wondering who I'm talking to, if you've just tuned in, it's Professor Angus Dalgleish. He's Professor of Oncology at St George's University of London. He's got some very strong views on the kind of reforms that should be instituted in the NHS. A lot of people listening to you, Professor, might think, well, 3 or 4 times now he said, well, we need to go back to how it used to be. Now, that could be construed, if one's being unkind, as a bit of a sort of old gittish attitude that, oh, it's not like it was back in the day. Surely we can't go back. Well, it depends how far you want to go back, I suppose. But somebody sent in a text earlier, I can't find it now, but it's saying that we've got a 1949 system operating for 21st century healthcare. We can't keep going back. Surely we have to look at the situation and work out what the situation needs to be today rather than replicate what there was in 1994 or whatever.
Oh, well, I mean, that's very true. We have to do what is required today. But what I was really emphasising is it is the reform after reform after reform has made things worse. What actually worked well was clinically led services. And I alluded to this with a colleague suddenly left without any management and having to cope with surgical services and the COVID ward. They got the team together and they sorted it out perfectly when they were able to make all the management decisions. Now, that's the way it used to be. That's how I was brought up. And it worked very, very well. For instance, when I was in Australia, I worked in Australia for 7 years, so I have a lot of experience of non-NHS.
You were part of the brain drain.
I was part of the brain drain because I saw that it was a mess then, and I was young. I wanted to try other things. And in fact, I got offered a job as a flying doctor. That was it for me.
Oh, fascinating.
I always wanted to fly, so off I went. But I stayed there. And trained in internal medicine and then oncology, etc. So I worked in Queensland and I worked in New South Wales, and they both have different versions of healthcare systems. They have similarities, but there's marked differences. Brisbane's closer to the NHS, but they both had things which, left up to me, I would instigate here immediately because they work really, really well. The other thing is, I mean, they realise if you have a health service that you want to give everything to everybody who needs it, you run into the system that we do now where demand exceeds supply. And that means you either have a Soviet-style rationing system, which is basically how the NHS is working now, and everyone's paying the price for it, or you have to instigate what works so well in Australia and my experience in France and Austria, where I have many colleagues and friends who live there and have used the system. You need to have some system of you contribute to the very service you have. So I think you do have to have a system where you pay to go to the GP, you pay to go to the A&E, and you have a health card.
But we already do through our taxes.
Well, you have, but it doesn't guarantee you anything. You just have to join the big waiting line, up to 4 or 5 days in some cases. This way, you get a real good priority triage system. Now, I know people who've been totally against this, and I know a lot of listeners would be totally against the whole concept. But I was amazed to talk to one of my consultants who is very pro-Labour and I would call very left-wing, who's a consultant, who said, if we had even a £20 charge for A&E, it would reduce the workload by 20% and we could cope. And the other thing I realised from this discussion was that 80% of the workload in A&E is caused by about 20% of people, and the crisis is basically caused because they can't go and see the GP. And that brings to another thing that needs to be...
Well, I wanted to move on to that
right.
because when we spoke on Tuesday, I was quite intrigued about your criticism of the GP service. I mean, you almost seem to regard it as irrelevant.
Oh, I wouldn't say it's irrelevant. I mean, it was a superb system while it worked, but the fact that it was never going to cope was very, very obvious 10 years ago. And, without engendering any istic views, the fact that when they were all boasted that there was as many women training as men, and then there were going to be more women, it was obvious that we would need a considerably more number to train GPs, because it was known that the majority of the women going to GP want to work part-time. Actually, now we've had the gender equality's kicked in and the men want to work part-time as well. So, that was one of the reasons we've had less GP patient hours. But the big destruction of the GP services was when Tony Blair gave them a new contract which allowed them not to have responsibility at weekends and after hours. It was a total disaster because it allowed them to withdraw. With that full-time contract, there was a responsibility, which basically people use that to go out the window. If you're part-time, you don't have this 24-hour responsibility, and that was one of the things. So then we get this massive demand of patients on the GPs, the massive increase in bureaucracy with all sorts of things, like with Dr. Shipman, who was clearly a lunatic who was killing his patients, went to jail for it. They immediately assumed that we were all like that, and they had to instigate validation, appraisals, everything to make sure he weren't a murderer. This is another thing that wasted so much time, and I know it is a process which led to many of my friends retiring early from a GP. Now, my big thing about the GP service is that it clearly wasn't going to be able to cope, and the pandemic actually revealed the final chink in the armour, as it were, when it all collapsed. The problem with the GP services in this country, it is the gatekeeper. So it is the gatekeeper to all hospital and diagnostic services. And this has been revealed. My own friends have phoned me up to discuss things because they've developed various conditions. They've been to the GP, one of them's a senior academic, the other's a senior other medical person, and the GP said, OK, we'll phone you in 3 weeks' time. On listening to their complaints, they both had problems which didn't need a telephone call in 3 weeks' time. They needed a scan and a blood test today or tomorrow.
It was like when the government announced this commitment to making sure that you can see your GP within 2 weeks. And I'm thinking, you're trumpeting this as if it's some kind of good thing.
Well, I remember at the last election where every single candidate said, we promise you 6,000 more GPs, everyone, Labour, Conservative, Liberal, they all. And I said, where are they going to come from when the successive governments have refused to train the doctors that we need? They've all said it costs too much to train a doctor. It's much easier to go around and steal them from abroad, which is basically the model that they seem to be working on. Now, that makes me very annoyed because I see lots of really bright young people who've got their A-levels, they're desperate to do medicine. They make ideal doctors, but they can't get in. And, I know I talk to teachers, senior teachers of big major schools who say it is terrible. They've got so many people who be ideal for medicine, but there's no places for them. I think we should open it up the way other countries do, and anybody who achieves a certain level, we should go in the first year and have a pyramidal system that those who really want to persist and put up with it, they go through and you drop. And any of these professional things, you do need to account for a dropout scenario, because one of the problems we don't have consultants is that when I trained, we had a pyramidal structure. So every year you had to fight for your position, and say if there was 8 of you, there's only going to be 6 in the next year and possibly 4 in the next year. So it's pyramidal. And we ended up with every post had 3 or 4 or 5 people competing for it, so the system was good. And then they introduced this equality, all must have prizes, all must be winners, and it became an elevator system. So if you went in at the first year, you were guaranteed 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and they didn't account for the fact that after 2 or 3 years, people said, stuff is, I'm not going to do this anymore, I would rather do something else. And it's the training, the whole training decisions were just not thought through.
You're getting a lot of reaction on the text and tweets. Until the last couple of minutes, virtually everybody was saying, this is what I want to hear. It's innovative thinking. Couple of people just texted, not really agreeing with a lot of what you're saying, but that's inevitable given the subject that we're talking about. We're going to open up the phone lines now, 0345 6060 973, if you'd like to put a call in to Professor Angus Dalgleish. It's 8:31. News headlines on LBC with Daryl Jackson.
It's 5 days before Prince Harry's memoir is out, and some of the stories in it are coming out already. He claims he wanted to reopen the investigation into his mother's death. He took cocaine when he was 17, and he killed 25 Taliban insurgents in Afghanistan. Ministers are proposing new laws to deliver minimum safety levels during strikes by public sector workers. The Business Secretary insists walkouts must be balanced with the public's right to life and livelihoods. And Ukraine's rejected a 36-hour ceasefire from tomorrow that President Putin's announced to mark the Russian Orthodox Christmas holiday. Kyiv says there can't be one until Moscow's forces get off Ukrainian land. LBC weather, rain moving into the far southeast tonight. Scattered showers are expected in northern and western Scotland, and a low of 3.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
Professor Angus Dalgleish is with me. We're talking about how best to reform the creaking NHS. I think most of us can agree that it's certainly creaking, if not worse. And we're seeing all the signs of that creaking at the moment, particularly with regard to A&E services and GP services. Let's go to your calls. Miles is in Croydon. Hello, Miles.
Hi, Iain. Hi, Professor Dalgleish.
Hello.
Very interesting conversation. Hi.
Thank you.
My question is really around the long-term planning of skills and resources in the NHS. And if there's one area in public life where we know we need huge amounts of resource for the next 20, 30, 50, 100 years, it's in healthcare and social care. Therefore, the government surely should be making a much more long-term plan and investment in the training and bringing skills in and ongoing skills for young people wanting to go into nursing, doctors, healthcare more broadly, and social care, and giving them a career and investing for the long term, rather than what feels like very knee-jerk reaction decisions that create lumpy provision of training. You mentioned that earlier about shortage of medical vacancies, but I mean, nursing itself today is a hugely technical career and discipline, and lots of nurses very quickly get to a very high level of medical capability and service they can provide. Very exciting career for people to go into, but there isn't that sort of long-term structure and plan with investment to create that capacity that we know we definitely need.
Well, the big problem is that all the long-term plans that have been made for the NHS have been for the duration of the Parliament concerned. And so there's been no proper long-term planning, which is why I feel that a great step forward would be for the parties to realise they cannot use the NHS as a political football anymore, and to have an all-party agreement on the long-term future and planning for the NHS. They might not get round to an agreement, but with a 5-year rolling Parliament, you do need much longer planning for the healthcare service.
But you can't take the politics out of the NHS, can you? Because when you're spending upwards of £150 billion of taxpayers' money every year, £1 in £6 that is spent on the NHS. There's got to be political accountability there.
Well, I totally agree, but you can still have largely government funding, taxpayers' funding, but through a totally different mechanism that achieves long-term goals. Because at the moment, it's just a reflex. So I gave the NHS another $10 billion to cope with social care crisis or the knock-on effects of COVID. So that's all okay then. Unless you do the structure, and the NHS is not fit for purpose. You have to admit, I basically said that I gave a little vignette about going to the top of the Department of Health to discuss all the issues. They discussed it all, and the final comment was, well, at the end of the day, at least the NHS is the best healthcare system in the world. And I say, until you realise and accept that it's not, it's like talking to an alcoholic, trying to get him off drinking without admitting there's a problem. And that's what the NHS is. It is so solidified that it cannot move to adapt to this. And that's why I think we should try for an all-party agreement on it, because it's a political football that every party promises to spend more on, but the money just goes into a bottomless pit. And now we are paying the price for it. So I would really stick to that.
Miles, thank you. Let's move on to Sarah in Wimborne in Dorset. Hello, Sarah. What would you like to say?
Hello to you both. Good to hear this. It's great what Angus is talking about. What I'd like to say is good to hear you talking about the nurses as well. I was a nurse, and, it's how do we get the nurses back? How do we, get back to old-style, good, basic nursing care again? How do we do that?
Well, one of the
heartbreak is not the nurses. It's because of the mismanagement of it all at the moment.
Well, I totally agree. And of course, I talk to nurses, and I know a lot of nurses, both from years ago and those who are working at the moment. And with regards to what the patients need, one of the great big revolutions that went on, which is, I believe, is a major problem, is that all nurses must have a degree. And I think this was a dreadful decision, because you took them out, they have to pay for that degree now, and then they go on to the wards. They're not really equipped for it. I think we should go back to the system where you paid the nurses to learn, and we also had it's called state enrolled nurses when I was younger, and they actually nursed from day one. They were extremely good. They weren't under pressure to do a BSc in pharmacology or something like that, for which they were not suited. But often the people who go and do the BSc in nursing decide that they don't really want to do the nursing, and that's another reason why it's very hard to get the people who really want to nurse look after people.
How does that work with recruiting all of these nurses from overseas? I mean, how do you... I mean, they can't all have degree-level qualifications, surely?
No, they haven't. I mean, it's all sticking plaster responses, bringing in people for overseas, when we should be doing our own. And the fact we've basically told nurses that instead of giving them bursaries and paying them for the work they do, which is the logical thing, it's an apprentice-type system, and we should go back to it. Why should we put these nurses into debt so they're having to pay to get a degree, that when they go out and start earning with that degree, they can't actually ever really pay that debt off? So, I mean, it's an absolutely... No one's thought that one through other than short term. Oh, we get the nurses to pay for the degree, then that fixes that cash flow situation. No, that puts nurses off, and they rapidly think, oh, I'm never going to get a good salary with this. And if they do, and here's the other brunt, the good ones, they go on and they get in charge of wards and units, etc., and they reach a ceiling. And they suddenly realise they can't go any further in that nurse career structure unless they become a manager. So we lose the good hands-on nurses who become managers because they can't afford to stay on the position they were.
Sarah, thank you. Mark is in Bermondsey. Hello, Mark.
Yeah, hello there. Yeah, I wonder if the professor would like to comment on the partnership model, which is in primary healthcare. You talked about some of the inefficiencies in primary healthcare, but I don't think a lot of people know that GP surgeries are private businesses. They don't have to compete for their contracts. Their contracts come down without any competition. But what happens is that they are owned by a group of GPs who are called partners, and they then run the services on really as little amount as they need to spend, because they increase then their profits, which they spread amongst themselves. I mean, I was a practice manager for a fair amount of time, great doctors, etc. But I always felt, actually, I was getting enough money off the government to run services, but there was pressure on me to do it as cheaply as possible because, of course, the partners lived off those drawings. You never hear this talked about when people talk about private healthcare, but it's sort of capitalism, but without the competition.
Well, thank you very much for bringing that up, because that is one of the issues which I think is very old. The old school of it was when the GPs basically they actually did get a fantastic deal from the government. They were paid for the number of patients that they had, whether they saw them or not, on a per capita basis, not on for what they did. And it was a very good system. Plus, they got access to the big state pensions, which enables them to retire.
But presumably that was great for people living in rich areas, but less great for people who were treating people in poorer areas.
Yeah, indeed. So, I mean, I thought this through. With the collapse of the GP practices, I think that this is no longer tenable. And indeed, I speak to an accountant, a friend of mine who does a lot of GP practices, and this model is actually not suiting them either, particularly with a lot of partners who want to work part-time. So with regards to the front line, as I said, we cannot allow the GPs to be gatekeepers anymore of the access to health service. I personally would put a primary basic care into the front line of hospitals. So that would include the A&E, urgent outpatient, urgent diagnostics, and I would rotate the GPs in with the hospital, and they would no longer be independent partners. And that way they would have a much greater access, interest and ownership of primary care and the results thereof. Because at the moment they wait for what the consultant says, wait 2 or 3 weeks for the letter before it gets back, etc. And I think it's a very inefficient system now. When we had more than enough GPs, as you say, especially in rich areas, it worked very well. It's all collapsing, so we have to adapt. If you don't adapt to ongoing changes to these systems, you end the way of the dinosaur, and that's how I feel that we're going at the moment.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. Keep your calls coming, 0345 6060 973. It's 8:45.
LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
It's 8:47. John is in Binfield. John, hello. What would you like to ask the Professor?
Good evening, chaps. Very, very entertaining conversation indeed. You should get the Professor on again after this.
We may well do, because I'll tell you what, it's getting huge reaction on text and tweets. And I would say, I mean, this is just, I'm scanning them all the time. I'd say it's a 90-10 positive reaction, which, as you know, John, when you do phone-ins like this, that's not always the case.
No, indeed. But he's speaking so much sense. Professor, I've got a couple of questions to ask you or get your thoughts on. What frustrates me is this nursing agency, stroke doctor agency thing that keeps coming up in the news. It's been going on for probably at least 20 years. But if we can afford to pay these exorbitant rates for not only the respective staff that come through the agency, but also the markup as well, surely if you have a facility to shut that down, you can employ all of those staff back into the NHS.
Assuming they want to go back.
Everybody a pay rise. That was the first question. And the second one was similar to saving some money, is these purchasing departments. I believe that each NHS trust has their own one.
Yes, well,
is that so?
I'm not sure, but I suspect that they do. But I definitely should trust they have autonomy to do various things themselves. With regards to the agency question, it is ridiculous that we have a situation where we have privatised agencies which will provide doctors and nurses to hospitals that desperately need it. And they are paying, I think I saw a report in the paper of over £5,000 for a doctor for a shift because they couldn't get anybody locally. This is another outcome of total lack of long-term planning. And certainly, if you're going to have a control of the workforce, you must have the NHS, or the what I believe should replace it, ought to have its own agency for these things. I mean, the agency is being privatised, and it is basically milking the NHS dry for enormous fees, which should be going on the doctors and nurses who are doing the work. Now, I can tell you one truth that I am aware of. I know of these agencies have worked out the NHS so well that they are actually persuading nurses working on a ward to join them, knowing that they will have to resupply them back to fill their old posts, and it costs the NHS about 3 times the rate for doing it.
And that is a public scandal.
That is a total public scandal. And if I could just address the second part of your question about the purchasing thing, is I have talked to many people who are suppliers for the NHS, everything from drug companies to those who do the building work, the interior redesign, the food, the things like special gluten-free cakes and everything. It would appear that the NHS pays at least 3 times as much for anything than anybody else could get it. I saw that there's one case where there's some gluten-free bread required for a ward. They ended up paying £20 for a loaf for the way that they purchased things.
£20?
Yeah, when you could get it for £2 from the very store downstairs in the foyer of the hospital. I mean, and this is the sort
But how can that be allowed?
It just seemed to be ingrained in the NHS.
I mean, I know there are, if you're in a PFI hospital, I mean, there are contracts that, and that's why it costs £20 to change a light bulb or whatever it is. But that is just a scandal.
Yeah, and it is part of the PFI scandal. I mean, I'd just like to remind the listeners just how bad this was. It was Gordon Brown who pushed this. I believe it was a Tory idea with one or two tried initially.
First came in under John Major, but I think 90% of PFIs were under Gordon Brown.
And this is where we borrowed about 12 billion pounds to keep the debt off the books, but contracted that we would pay back 97 billion 20 years later, and not own the hospitals we'd used that money for and have to renegotiate a lease. And that they were so sloppy, they included all the other services like light bulbs and things like that, as you say, that they would have to provide all these services to save the hospital the time. And they ended up costing many, many times.
But the fact is, as I said to you on Tuesday, without that, you wouldn't have these brand spanking new hospitals that were built during that period.
Well, I would argue that you should have had and not gone down the PFI route. I mean, as you say that the NHS gobbles up the vast majority of our tax-paying.
Well, one in £6 that's spent by the government is spent on the NHS.
Yes, and the only things that beats that is welfare and pensions and things like that. So
right, let's move on. John, thank you. Bushra is in Ruislip. Bushra is a friend of the programme. She's a GP, phones in regularly. Bushra, what would you like to say?
Hi, Iain. Hello, Professor. So I thought it might be useful for me to just call and give a first-hand input for GPs or primary care. So I have limited experience compared to you, Professor. I've been a GP for 7 years. But in the years that I have been a GP, what I've seen is the GP contract is asking GPs to do more and more for the same payment. And what I've seen in literally the last few years is my colleagues not being able to cope. So you were mentioning women coming into general practice and working part-time, but actually what I'm finding is that male colleagues are also working part-time because the pressures are so great. And that is, and then another point I wanted to address was the partnership model. So what is now happening is partners are finding it very, very hard to recruit other GPs, to recruit staff. Nobody wants to work for the NHS. You have private online GP services who are very attractive because instead of seeing, 6 patients in an hour, you're seeing 3 or 4, you're seeing them from home. And the only people standing on the ground, well, actually, no, that's not fair, not the only, but, the partners are definitely still holding everything together. They have that responsibility for their patient list. And there have been studies to show that continuity of care. So, GPs do provide that integral sort of overview of a patient from childhood into older life, and when they're elderly, and they can pick up problems in a patient, put it all together.
Bushra, we're slightly running out of time. If you've got a question for the professor, I'd be grateful if you could ask it.
It was really just to counteract the partnership issue. I just disagree. I just think the partnership is really the only way forward, because partners have an overview of patients, have that responsibility, and really what we need to do is have primary care, secondary care working together and supporting each other, and not breaking down that partnership, because we'll have no primary care left otherwise.
Well, I'm going to take it the professor the disagreement will continue there, but thank you very much, Bushra. John is in Lincoln. Hello, John.
Hiya there, Alan. How are you tonight?
Very well,
Wonderful.
thank you. What would you like to say?
Good. Okay, first time caller, very nervous, but there we go. I'm just driving back from Nottingham QMC after dropping my 19-year-old daughter off, who started in September as a nursing student. And quite frankly, she's going to go through 3 years of studying. She's 50 grand in debt, and she's been talking to me today that she says she's going to be earning roughly the same as what she would have been earning in the coffee shop that she was working in last year. Now, that as a degree student nurse coming out of university, I think is diabolical. But the actual course that she's doing is probably 50. It's a full-time course, but she's spending more time kicking her heels and waiting, where I'm sure that it could be done in 2 years, because a friend of ours has just gone on a mental health nursing course, and because she's got another degree, it's a 2-year course. So, for me, they just need to get the nursing students into university, make it more effective and efficient, get them onto the wards, get boots on the ground and get them working in there and getting on the job training.
That's far too sensible, John. Far too sensible.
Far too sensible. Me as a firefighter, it's 13 weeks training, and then I'm put on the front line, and you develop as you go, and you work through the system as you go.
Okay,
you can't simulate nursing and firefighting. But
let's see what Angus thinks.
Well, I think that's exactly what I said. I mean, it's pointless having all nurses having degrees when you need people who really want to nurse, who are not that particularly interested in doing a degree, certainly not initially, and they don't want to get into debt. And that's why I say, we want to go back a bit to the old model of the state-enrolled nurse too. And you pay them while they're learning.
I wonder what the Royal College of Nursing would think of this. I mean, were they the people behind the degree thing in the first place?
To be quite honest, I don't know who actually drove this. Certainly the universities were very keen, always looking to maximise income, etc. But from a practical point of view, I think it has not been helpful getting all nurses to have degrees.
Right, we've got time for one more question. John, thank you for yours. Let's go to Sid in Islington. Hello, Sid.
Hi, good evening. Professor Dalgleish, you've made some very valid and very interesting points. I work as a GP, and I've been working in the NHS for coming up to 34 years. The points you've made about the reforms, the abolishing of the doctor's mess, and so on, are entirely valid, including the ridiculous appraisals and the revalidation and everything. I was just interested to explore the point you made, or you were making, about the deficiencies in the GP system at the time of the pandemic. I just wanted to get a better understanding of what you said, and I wanted to respond to that.
Okay, well, I mean, and this is personal experience with friends and family, was that the doors came shuttered down, and you couldn't access the GPs because there was this fear of COVID, which was centrally driven. And I think that it was not justified. The disease wasn't that as what it has been portrayed as, and there was a great resistance to open up. Now, all different GPs were different, but I mean, mean, a friend of mine went around and collated GP surgeries which said, do not, because of COVID, do not enter here, this, that and the other. You must go through phone and have a phone-to-phone consultation. And this was going on even after the lockdowns were lifted. So that's what I mean. There was a great difference too. Some GPs surgeries adapted very well. But a lot of people had this problem that they felt they were completely shut off. And this was what I wrote a lot about at the beginning, is if you have a lockdown and you become a national COVID service, the price you pay the next 2 or 3 years in excess deaths from conditions that were not managed because of this, diagnosed early and managed, would be enormous. And unfortunately,
and that's what we're seeing today with
exactly
these stats that have come out.
Yeah, we've just had the massive excess death today of 21%, which is absolutely unbelievable in this time, way post-pandemic. And I think the vast majority of that is knock-on effect from the lockdown, which I said right at the beginning we should never have had. Angus Tegel, the CMO of Sweden, he explained very well why it would be a disaster, and I was 100% behind him and signed the Great Barrington Declaration. And we are now paying the price for a very stupid decision, and I'm very happy to say it's a stupid decision because I argued with the people who made it very strongly at the time, but unfortunately I lost.
Sid, I'd love to let you back in, but we've reached the end of the hour. Thank you very much indeed for calling in. Someone's texted in saying, fantastic hour, Iain. I hope the government are listening, learning and taking this on board. I hope it's not just the government, actually. I hope it's people who work in NHS England, civil servants in the Department of Health, senior managers in the NHS. I think, look, we're not going to get to the bottom of everything in an hour's discussion, but certainly I think there's been a lot of food for thought that we've all encountered over the last hour. So, Professor, thank you very much indeed. You can access this hour on Global Player after the programme, and I think it'll be on the LBC YouTube channel as well. Coming up in a moment, we are going to talk about Prince Harry. Yes, we really are. A lot of people thought we should have done that in the first hour, but frankly, I thought Keir Starmer's speech was rather more important. But we are going to talk about these outrageous claims that he's been making today. He claims Prince William physically attacked him and he was